and incentivizes collaboration. The biggest gap being around adaptation, both in terms of understanding the data as well as the solutions. And in South and Southeast Asia, some of the things that we heard is governance needs to be at the heart of potential success for climate action, but there's a need for consistent strategy across political transitions. And cities need accessible translations of the latest science, not only to inform and to provide the evidence, but for their own policy, but also in order to educate citizens starting at an early age. You're going to hear more about, next slide please, you can continue. You'll hear more about the details of these 3 reports, which you can see here. They're now available for download off the website. And so all of them are available, as well as additional insights and summaries. I thought there was another slide, but go ahead. Yes, so there's also 2 additional reports. The action agenda, which we're going to be releasing next week in the multi-level action pavilion with the LGMA, which is very exciting. Kind of the what's next to come and what we need to do. And this, I would also wanted to mention, this is building off of work that we already did in terms of the summary for Urban Policymakers off the special report of 1.5. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to a dear friend, colleague, mentor, and friend, Aromar Revi. Aromar was a coordinating lead author also on the 2018 special report for global warming and the summary for Urban Policymakers. He's currently a coordinating lead author on the synthesis chapter for climate resilient development pathways of the IPCC AR6 on adaptation, and a member of the co-writing team for the IPCC AR6 synthesis report. Aro, floor is yours.
Thank you, Seth. We're going to run through this very quickly because I want the co-chairs and you to have a voice in this. So just run through the slides, please. Next slide. So basically a few highlights. Next slide. I think one of the most important things that we've had is that we've had in this process, which is a derivative process from the IPCC, starting in SR 1.5, taking the messages that we had, which brought together adaptation, mitigation, and implementation into the action and the implementation space. It was a great pleasure, and it really, made this possible to have all the 6 co-chairs to come in and support us as review editors across working group 1, 2, and 3. Which is, I think, a remarkable and important process, a precursor of what we want to see in the next cycle as we move forward to bring adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development together, the so-called climate resilient development pathways. Next slide. So a large number of authors. We're very glad to see so many of you here. It's been a long journey. It's been a tremendous process of co-creation across working groups and with our partners and cities and businesses. It's been a learning all throughout, right across the world. It's been a remarkable experience, and I think we're very happy to continue this process, especially as the next cycle will hopefully relatively quickly have the first special report on cities sometime early in the cycle. Next slide, please. So very quick highlights, and the core question is, in a world in which more than half the world population sits in cities, 2/3 of the economy comes in cities, and 3/4 of the emissions, everything is connected in an urban world. And a change in one part of the system impacts every other, as we've seen during COVID. Next slide. So emissions driven by current policies will cause global warming to exceed 2 degrees C by about 2050. One of the core things, and I've been sort of knocked for this in various places, is that we have to absolutely prepare to make sure that we do not exceed 1.5 on the mitigation side, but we would be rather foolish and inappropriate if we did not prepare for adaptation for 2.7 and above. That's not what these IPCC reports are saying. That's what I'm saying as an individual scientist. Next slide, please. Next. So there's very clear evidence from working group 1 that some cities in Asia and small Arctic cities are experiencing increased local temperatures. This is a fact, and you can see the evidence in this. We'll pick that up. Panmao will pick that up in working group 1. Next slide, please. We found very interesting things happening in urban areas. You can see the impact of city geometry, heat from human activities, and heat retaining properties to increase temperatures. But there are also solutions. Solutions in the green and blue space, where you see water and vegetation, green and blue infrastructure actually making a significant difference to heat waves. Next slide, please. So urban climate change mitigation has a crucial role in determining the future of the global climate. In fact, mitigation in some ways is the most effective form of adaptation. The quicker we mitigate, the quicker we decarbonize, the less we have to adapt to, even at 1.1, as we go to 1.5 and potentially search for an overshoot. Next slide. The important message that comes across from this entire cycle is that we have solutions. Many of these solutions are feasible. We've found that across both mitigation and adaptation. Many of them have synergies, and most important, they are strong synergies with the Sustainable Development Goals. So in actual fact, the evidence shows very clearly that the glass is more than half full, that there are more feasible options than those that are not, and they can bring adaptation and mitigation together. So technically, all of this is possible. The challenge is in the implementation. Next slide, please. So of course, mitigation has many benefits. Next slide. And enhanced mitigation can create a lot of new opportunities around jobs, around income, around reducing inequality. This is a very important process in a post-COVID world where we're looking at investment in infrastructure, urbanization, a whole range of processes to enable economies and livelihoods to come back. So cities and urban areas and the areas in which they're embedded are very critical to be able to sort of recover post-COVID, stabilize in macroeconomies, and of course, deliver climate resilient development in the long run. Next slide, please. So one of the core messages that we have from this cycle is that we need 5 simultaneous system transitions. And these are simultaneous. There's no option now of trade-off against one and the other. We're not all the way back in Rio. And I'll just articulate them with the urban and infrastructure transition as the center. Of course, energy systems, and that transition is very critical to decarbonization. Industrial systems that are not doing too well, both on mitigation and less on adaptation. And two other critical transitions, one around land, coastals, oceans, and freshwater ecosystems that I think Debra will talk about. So basically the coupling of natural and human systems that we really have to look at, because it's a coupling that makes a difference. And something that we've learned from the literature and of course from the experience of COVID, societal choices are very critical to enabling the acceleration of these processes so that we're able to get where we want to in less than a generation. Next slide, please. So the critical thing and the biggest barriers are in the enabling conditions that can promote or advance the system transitions, and eventually what we do need is transformation. There's no confusion about that. The transitions are a way forward for transformation. Climate change is a systemic question. It has to be dealt with systemically. You cannot break it down and deal with it in fragments in some senses. Next slide. So we find that cities and urban areas offer critical spaces to realize climate resilient development by implementing adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development together. We've got very good evidence on it. Please go and see that in the reports. Next slide. So cities can implement aggressive and ambitious climate policies. We know this for a fact. We've talked to colleagues from cities across the world. We have 2 mayors here from very different parts of the world. And cities in some senses have led the agenda for the integrated implementation of these processes. You cannot achieve the SDGs unless there's a core partnership between national governments and local governments. And when you bring adaptation and mitigation together at the local level, you can solve a whole range of issues simultaneously. This is not easy because institutional capacities are weak, mandates are sometimes weak in some places, resources are not there. And in some senses, we really need to mobilize citizens, businesses, a whole range of civil society partners to bring this together. And if we're able to do that, and my colleagues who've helped write this and frame this in some senses, we have the opportunity to move towards climate resilient development that can both improve and enhance human health, but also look at planetary health at the same time. So that's a quick sense of the processes we're talking about. 5 system transitions, critical enabling conditions as far as that's concerned, and then we have half a chance of trying to move in the direction of climate resilient development and shifting development pathways towards sustainability. So I'll stop there and I will hand over to Panmao, the co-chair of Working Group 1, and the Working Group 1 team has led the production of Volume 1. So over to you, Panmao.
Thank you, Aro. Thank you for catching us back on time. We have Panmao. Great. Just by way of a brief introduction to everybody, for those of you who don't know, Panmao Zhai is co-chair of Working Group 1, as Aro just mentioned, of the IPCC 6 assessment cycle. He's focused on the physical science underpinning past, present, and future climate change. He's also the Secretary General of the Chinese Meteorological Society and has more than 30 years working experience in climate change and variability studies. I think we've got you here, Panmao. We can see you. Over to you, and thank you for joining, even though it's so late where you are.
And Panmao is one of China's leading urbanists as far as climate change is concerned, published very extensively on urban questions.
Thank you. Could you please allow me to share the slides? The organizer should give me the permission, to share this slide. You hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Panmao. What we're trying to see is if we can have the slides up while we've also got you in on video. So right now we see
Okay.
you, but not the slides.
Yeah, because I cannot activate. This.
Yes. Can you guys give him permission?
You should give me an organizer permission, like. Oh, yes. Can you see now?
Yes, we got you, Panmao.
Okay, dear colleagues, I'm very glad to participate in this important event. Policymakers, and then on behalf of my
Yeah, Panmao, we're losing you. Oh, I'm sorry, Panmao, we can't hear you. Yeah, I think. We're gonna ask. I'm gonna ask Aro to run through those slides for you since we can't do both with Panmao. Aro, yeah, why don't you walk us through working group 1?
I'm a very poor substitute for Panmao in this space, but Panmao, I'm going to try and impersonate you for 5 minutes. So basically, we're going to run over what the first report says, and the title of the report is What the Latest Physical Science on Climate Change Means for Cities and Urban Areas. The core question that came up here was the climate crisis is absolutely here. The human-induced climate change is increasingly affecting every region and every system of the world, including through more intense and weather extreme. You can see the figure here, which basically looks at climate change impacts in terms of hot extremes. That's the image that you see in red on the left. And on the right, you can see observed changes in heavy precipitation, the kind of things that we see when we're experiencing extreme events across the world literally every day. The challenge at the moment in the world is that 1.5 events are happening every day in terms of extreme events. Next slide, please. Every region in the world will experience concurrent and multiple changes in climate impact drivers. And climate impact drivers are like cyclonic storms, like flooding, like extreme heat, at higher levels of global warming. So what we are seeing today is just the warm-up to a much more serious set of processes that we're going to see across the world. And in many places, these are causing compound events. Two things that are coming together: sea level rise, storm surge, and extreme weather coming together. So next slide, please. So the science is very clear that cities and urban areas are sources of the climate forces, because two-thirds or more, in some cases 3/4 of the emissions in some countries, are coming from urban areas. And they're also simultaneously sites of innovation and the implementation of adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development. That's a very interesting thing that we have to balance. The source of where the challenges come from and the opportunities. The question is, can we develop a framework of governance, of implementation, of partnership that can address these questions together? This is something that I dealt with earlier. Emissions implied by current policies will cause warming to exceed 2 degrees centigrade by about 2050. So even with strong emissions reduction, the increase of cumulative carbon dioxide emissions will result in global warming that will exceed 1.5 in the next 20 years. And I think one of the core questions for us is, as we move to a regime of overshoot beyond 1.5, how are we going to engage within cities and, of course, a whole range of ecosystem services that cities depend on? Cities don't produce most of their food, their water, so how do we bring this together? And we have sort of very strong evidence on this from pretty much every region in the world. Next slide, please. So this is evidence that we have from Working Group 1 here that looks at temperature increases in different regions of the world. So if you look at India, you see Kolkata there at plus 2.6 degrees Celsius. So essentially the message from this is at current increases of global mean surface air temperatures at 1.1 degrees, warming is larger over land, certainly in the Arctic and amplified in the cities. You can see that in the image with higher temperatures towards the higher latitudes. But most cities and urban areas will experience increases in temperature of over 1.5 degrees. That's one of the core things that are there. So in many parts of the world, we're well over 1.5, we may be well over 2 degrees in the local areas. So it's there, it's happening, and it's unfortunately becoming the cause of a whole range of impacts in different parts of the world. Next slide, please. Heavy rainfall events, and we've seen this most recently in Pakistan, but year upon year you can see this pretty much in every part of the world. We had dramatic changes in Africa and Durban. We had a whole series of processes that happened just before that a number of years ago in Bangkok. So literally in every region you can see heavy rainfall events becoming more intense, and we know what that means in terms of flooding of buildings, heavy precipitation that overwhelms transportation systems, like you can see in this image from Sri Lanka. Next slide. So the combination of extreme sea level, increase in storm surges and extreme rainfall and river flow events will increase coastal flooding. Now, the very important challenge that we have is the mega trend of urbanization is concentrated along low elevation coastal zones and along areas which are in floodplains pretty much across the world, fine? So as we concentrate more people in these regions, the combination of all of these sort of hydrometeorological events have the risk of increasing both mortality and damage to housing, transportation, and energy infrastructure. We see this in the news everywhere, but of course some regions of the world, especially in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, experience this multiple times in the year, and it's going to become worse. Next slide. Now, the interesting story, of course, is that there are solutions, and this slide I had showed you earlier. So while we have the impacts of city geometry, heat from human activities, and heat retaining properties actually leading to urban heat island impacts, there's also the impact of having green infrastructure, having blue infrastructure that can actually radically change and make an impact in terms of global warming impacts. But this is tied to land use, this is tied to the choices that we have in terms of urban planning and form, and these are more complex questions that actually we know about, but are difficult to implement in a world in which informality in urban areas, in which expansion of urban areas has become the norm in some senses, and sprawl has become very critical. Next slide, please. So this is an image that came from our global consultation in London. For those of you who are there, you can see Seth standing up at one end of the corner. You can see Sarah Colin-Brander looking over the session here. So basically, we now have a map of the solution space. This is a big shift since Paris. When we started the AR6 cycle, we knew about the solutions, but now we've been able to bring this together in a comprehensive way across mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development. So we do have a map of how this can be done, and there is clear evidence that cities will play a central role in how we adapt and mitigate, and of course we know that cities have a central role in the implementation of climate resilient development. So I think my impersonation of Panmao will stop there, and we can get on to, of course, to adaptation and mitigation. So Panmao, apologies. Over to you, Debra.
Thank you, Aro. I really appreciate you filling in, and very apologies to Panmao, who's staying up so late to join us. It's always very frustrating, but continuing on in our embarrassment of riches in having co-chairs present and in the room, I'm really happy to turn it over to Working Group to hear a little bit about Working Group 2 findings from Debra Roberts. Debra Roberts has been focusing on the vulnerability in socioeconomic and natural systems to climate change and options for adaptation. She's also the head of the Sustainable and Resilient Cities Initiative Unit in Durban, South Africa. She's been an advisor to the United Nations Secretary General's 2019 Climate Summit and was a member of the South African United UNFCCC negotiating team until December 2015. In 2019, she was included in the list of the world's 100 most influential people on climate policy. Debra, thank you so much for being here. Over to you.
Thanks, Seth. And Aro, that was quite a credible co-chair impersonation. So if we ever need someone in a support role, we know who to turn to. So Aromar's taken us through how the physical climate would change, which is great for those who model the atmosphere and take ice cores out of glaciers. For the rest of us, the question that follows is, well, so your aid. Because what the authors of this second volume have done is they've gone to the Working Group 2 main assessment and they've extracted all of the relevant and latest science as relates to impacts, adaptation and vulnerability and what it means for the world's urban areas and cities. Next slide, please. So what's the big message? Well, Aru's already touched on this. It's about joining the dots. The Working Group 2 report really indicated that systems are connected. And in the case of urban areas, everything is connected in an urban world. We've currently got about 4.2 billion people living in the world's cities. But the people and the economies and the societies that make up those urban areas do not exist in a vacuum. They do not exist in a bubble. They, in fact, are deeply connected with the climate system and with the natural system, the biodiversity and the ecosystems that support us. And these three systems are interrelated. They impact on one another. They change one another. So a change in one system will impact on the change in others. And we need to be mindful of that change. Next slide, please. Because indeed, the socioeconomic character of the world is changing. Rapid urbanization. You're currently sitting on the most rapidly urbanizing continent in the world. Dramatically changing land use, demographic shifts, growing inequality, increasingly unsustainable consumption. And many of those changes in the socioeconomic profile of the world contribute to increasing greenhouse gas emissions, driving an increase in global warming levels, but they certainly also undermine ecosystems, creating degradation and biodiversity loss. And what is important about the changes in those two systems, both climate, biodiversity, and ecosystems, is those trends are creating real existential challenges for the people who live in the world's cities. They're impacting on our economies, they're impacting on our urban areas. So this is the moment. If we're talking about interrelated systems, we need systemic and accelerated climate action by everyone. There isn't a single city, a single town, a single village in the world who can sit the stance out. Everyone has to be involved if we're going to tackle this challenge. Cities, urban areas provide us with a unique global scale, but importantly, time-limited opportunity to do something meaningful. Next slide, please. And this action is critical because, as Aromar has already indicated, even at current global warming levels, so remember we're sitting at about 1.1 degrees Celsius, urban areas are already experiencing very significant impacts from climate change. And as Aromar has indicated, some of the major cities around the world have already experienced mean warming of beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. Next slide, please. But when we think about understanding climate risks in the urban areas, we shouldn't only be thinking about changes in the climate hazards. So Working Group 1 tells us about the increase in temperature. They tell us about increasing sea level rise. But those risks are exacerbated by two other factors that we need to be extremely mindful of. Firstly, they're exacerbated by exposure. So if you concentrate large numbers of people, and remember some of our megacities have 20, 22 million people in them, you can imagine what a typhoon does when it rips through that kind of density. If you have inadequate buildings, if you have inadequate basic services and poor infrastructure, that all increases exposure to those climate hazards. We've also got to deal with vulnerability. So urban poverty, inequality, and uneven adaptive capacities. So any concern about reducing climate risks in urban areas needs to think about the hazard. And so if we think about the example on this slide of heat risk, if we're interested in reducing temperatures in urban areas from a hazard perspective, their climate mitigation is an obvious ask. But we can further reduce that risk if we concentrate on reducing exposure, if we provide increased green spaces in our urban areas, early warning systems, cooling shelters. Vulnerabilities are also an important opportunity to reduce risk, things like livelihood diversification and public health infrastructure. Next slide, please. And the concern about vulnerability in the world's urban areas is a critical one because climate impacts are felt disproportionately in socioeconomically marginalized communities. And this is a critical point. This is a big move forward for the Working Group 2 assessment report. Our strong focus on equity and human rights is a critical consideration in the response to climate change, and that applies to our urban areas as well, particularly in informal settlements. By the middle of the century, a third of us could be living in the informal settlements, high exposure, high vulnerability. Next slide, please. But we've also got to remember that the nature of climate risks that we're experiencing in the cities that we live in is also changing. Gone are the days when you could just expect a single extreme event to come your way. We now have to deal with a world in which multiple extreme events come together. They create compound and cascading risks, which are much more difficult for us to manage across different geographies and across different timescales. So think of the example that we've got on the slides. A major storm surge event or an extreme flood in a city which wipes out energy supply. That's going to impact on our transport systems, which means we can't move goods and people at exactly the time when we need to be able to move goods and people. It could potentially impact information technology, limit our ability to communicate during a time of stress. It could also impact on urban services, again at a time when we need them most, when society is stressed. So these compound risks will then have multiple impacts on urban societies. Next slide, please. So what are we doing in terms of adapting to the changes that are already manifest and the changes that are still to come? Well, adaptation is happening, but it's small scale, it's incremental, and it's simply not happening fast enough. So we have a major implementation gap in the adaptation space between what we should be doing and what we are doing. And this despite the fact that our assessment shows us that we've got about 170 countries around the world who've incorporated adaptation into their plans and policies, and many cities, over 100 cities, who've done a similar thing. So we've got this huge implementation gap. We've also got a real reality check, because even if we put our best foot forward and implement all of the planned adaptation, it's going to be insufficient to address the risks faced by urban areas. Next slide, please. This potential implementation gap, the inadequacy of adaptation interventions, is compounded by the fact that you can no longer adapt your way out of this problem, because there are very real limits to adaptation, particularly as those global warming levels increase. And so there's a very clear signal to us that any further delay in coming together as a global society and coming together as a global urban society to act on this challenge, to act on urban adaptation, is going to miss this rapidly closing window we have to secure a livable future for urban residents around the world. Next slide, please. So how do we get ahead of the game? Aromar has already indicated that a key way to kickstart the ambitious action that we need are through 5 key system transitions. And these system transitions allow us to deal with the interrelated risk between those 3 key systems I spoke about: nature, people, and climate. Key amongst these is obviously the transition in urban and infrastructural systems, but we've also got the transition in our natural systems, in energy systems, in industrial systems, and in society. And these systems come together and allow us to kickstart a development path which allows us to engage with adaptation, but also mitigation with a view to achieve sustainable development. And that sustainable development is important, because that's the window that allows us to bring in the human rights and equity concerns about our response in the world's urban areas. Next slide, please.
2 minutes, Debra.
Thanks. The urban infrastructural transition can be accelerated by a number of things. So planning is an excellent way of creating an urban form that allows us to protect ecosystems, creating adaptive capacity, but also compact urbanization, which allows us to deal with mitigation. Similarly, if we upgrade informal settlements through climate-resilient infrastructure, there can be both adaptation and mitigation advantages there. Ecosystem-based adaptation and nature-based solutions similarly offer us that combination of adaptation and mitigation. And we mustn't forget about social infrastructure, health, education, social safety nets, climate services, and disaster management. Next slide, please. But these actions need to be enabled, and there are critical enabling conditions like inclusive governance. We must welcome everyone to the table: public sector, private sector, civil society, the marginalized groups, informal settlers, the young, the old, women. We need political commitment and institutional capacity. We need money, and this COP is all about finance, and we need finance at the local level as well to drive this change. Technology and innovation are critical. Lifestyle and behavior change talks to the responsibility we all have to think about how we live in the world's cities, monitoring and evaluating our progress to see how effective our interventions are, but also attention to culture and heritage is providing important context. And we saw this emerge in a co-sponsored conference by UN Habitat and GCOM, co-sponsored by the IPCC, where amongst the urban people attending that conference, culture and heritage and the history of our cities were identified as important context for climate change action. Next slide, please. All this speaks to the fact that as society we have choices that put us on different pathways. Next slide, please. But it's important that we recognize that those adaptation pathways by themselves are not sufficient. Adaptation alone will not get us out of this problem. Aramar's already spoken to climate resilient development as a way of bringing together adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development. But that requires strategic long-term action that involves multiple stakeholders. And currently what we're doing is often project-based and short-term based on discrete actions. It doesn't meet the challenge of climate resilient development. Next slide, please. A good example of climate resilient development is nature-based solutions. They provide us with the opportunity to increase resilience and adaptation options in urban areas, sequester carbon dioxide, and enhance livelihoods, for example, through job creation. But important that they're used in a way that doesn't displace existing livelihoods or create inequity in urban areas. Next slide, please. And so ultimately, cities hold the key to climate resilient development. They've got a key role to play in these transitions and future transformations. So our climate is our future, but that future is an urban one. So a great deal depends on what we do with the world's cities. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Debra. And I hope you'll notice that we're ending with every slide with a list of all the lead authors who volunteered their time to do this. Now I'd like to turn it over to Jim Skea. Again, really excited to have Jim here, who's the co-chair of Working Group 3 on the sixth assessment cycle focused on climate change mitigation. Jim is part of the scientific leadership for the IPCC Special Report on the Global Warming of 1.5 degrees. He's also a professor of sustainable energy at Imperial College London with research interests in energy, climate change, and technological innovation. He's the chair of Scotland's Just Transition Commission and was a founding member of the UK's Committee on Climate Change, acting as its Scottish champion. Jim, thanks so much for being here. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Seth. And can I first of all say thanks to Seth and Arve for the opportunity to participate in this. This for me has been a beacon in terms of communication and clarity, in terms of relevant information for policymakers. And may I also say a timeliness. Getting this all done between two COPs is almost a miracle, which is a wonderful example for IPCC. So I will dive straight in. If we can have the first slide, please. So the current global urban population is currently about 4.5 billion, and it's going to get to about 7 billion by 2050, and we would expect it to grow further in the years after that. That will inevitably lead to a rise in demand for resources, infrastructure, and services, and limiting emissions is a major part of an urban and infrastructure transition. If we can just move on. Urban climate change mitigation is absolutely crucial in determining the future of the global climate, given the percentage of the global population who will be resident in cities. And the way that cities are planned, the way they're designed, built, retrofitted, managed and powered is going to very much influence urban greenhouse gas emissions. At the moment, a very large share of people in low-emitting countries lack access to modern energy and mobility services. And it's something we emphasised in the Working Group 3 report, that eradicating extreme poverty, energy poverty, does not put you into reverse gear when it comes to reducing global emissions. It is perfectly possible to reconcile these two objectives. Next slide. So, cities in the global south, which may be an early stage of development, they need new infrastructure, And this leads to potentially high material demand with associated embodied emissions. Whereas the problem in the global north is perhaps different, where we have older cities and the need there is to replace or rebuild aging infrastructure, retrofit buildings. And it is imperative that these challenges become addressed. Otherwise, we will have unsustainable emissions growth from urban consumption and production in the coming decades. Next slide, please. Now, this is a slide that takes a little bit of time to explain, so I won't go into it in too much detail. But essentially, this looks at 4 different sectors, and buildings supply people's needs for shelter, transport for mobility, food for nutrition, and industry to supply consumer demands. And you can look at the potential for emissions reduction in each of these systems using an avoid, shift, and improve framework. Avoid actions limit emissions through individual behaviour and lifestyle changes in the way that these services are provided. Shift actions enable choices so that you can get the same kind of services with different technologies and service provisioning systems, and improve actions help to increase end-use efficiency of these technologies. And what this figure on the right-hand side shows is how each of these types of actions could reduce emissions across the 4 sectors. The pink refers to the avoid actions, the green to the shift actions, and the blue to the improvement. And there are very substantial emission reductions possible through these strategies, ranging from about 30% reductions in industry through to about 2/3 reductions in buildings and transport. So a very large potential is identified. Now, if we can move on to the next slide, one of the things that we have done in the report is in terms of mitigation to look at different typologies of cities. And this slide divides cities into 3 broad groups: emerging cities, rapidly growing cities, and established cities, and further divides them into 2 types: those that are compact and walkable, and those which are more designed to be autocentric, so 6 categories in all. And this slide looks at the 5 system transitions that Aro mentioned in his first presentation, and looks at various opportunities, with the size of the blobs basically representing the size of the mitigation potential. Now, there's a lot in there, but just to summarize it, in new and emerging city, where there's a lot of new infrastructure coming along, the challenge is to achieve a high quality of life through energy-efficient infrastructures and services and people-centered urban design. Rapidly growing cities could avoid future emissions by co-locating jobs and housing to achieve compact urban form. And in established cities, you can achieve large emissions saving through efficiently improving, repurposing, or retrofitting the building stock, targeted infilling, and support non-motorised means of public transport. So a comprehensive set of opportunities there, looking at these different city typologies and the 5 different systems. If we could move it on, please. So cities of all these types can accelerate these 5 systems, a bit of repetition in this side, but urban mitigation actions are linked to these system transitions across the 5 systems that Aro identified. If we can just move that on, please. So there are a few cross-cutting points to be made as well. Cities and urban areas have a key role in energy systems transitions, both on the demand side and the supply side. Compact urban form can reduce energy demand, and demand management can increase energy systems flexibility to accommodate more variable renewable energy sources. Next slide, please. It's important that the land and ecosystems transitions are part of it. We know that land use change contributes up to 20% of greenhouse gas emissions, And land and ecosystems transitions can reduce emissions and climate impacts in cities by expanding local urban green and blue infrastructure. That means trees, more vegetation, more bodies of water, and promoting urban farming that limits transport and urban waste. And these urban initiatives in terms of land and ecosystems can also be a good carbon sink if they are appropriately managed. Next slide, please.
Jim, 3 minutes.
Industrial system transitions, cities can play an important role there because spatial planning can limit demand for materials, design standards, building codes, efficient material procurement, and recycling waste can play a big role there. Moving on to the next slide. Societal transitions, we've estimated that demand-side transitions strategies across all sectors can reduce emissions by up to 2/3 by 2050, and we absolutely need these societal transitions to accelerate the strategies and implement overall system transitions. Next slide, please. This is a slide, a variation of which has appeared in many IPCC reports over the last cycle. Basically, it's plotting different kinds of mitigation response actions and mapping them out systematically across the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think the big messages there is that the plus signs represent synergies, which tend to dominate the picture. Very few minuses in there indicate trade-offs, and the stars actually indicate where there's a mixture of positive and negative impacts. So among these, energy efficiency, expanding renewable energy have multiple sustainable benefits, and expanding clean energy and public transport use improves SDG outcomes on health, employment, energy security, and equity. Next slide, please. Enabling conditions are absolutely vital. This is a very short slide for quite a lot of material, but establishing the right enabling conditions can promote or advance system transitions, leading to a transformation overall. Urban policy and planning, governance, finance, lifestyle and behaviour change, and innovation or technology are key levers to accelerate mitigation. Next slide, please. Enhanced mitigation that shifts development pathways towards sustainability can create new green job opportunities, raise incomes, and reduce inequalities within and between countries. And I'm glad to see this is all happening in a city I lived in for 20 years in Brighton and in England. Next slide, please. Montreal in Canada, enhanced mitigation action can deliver local adaptation benefits, including flood risk, limiting urban heat island effects, and enhanced health because of air pollution. And issues like walkable areas compliant with clean energy, networks of green spaces, urban forests, urban agriculture, and water-sensitive design are all a critical part of the picture. Next slide, please. This is another city I know well because my partner comes from Athens in Greece, and I think this defies some of the categorization because it's both compact and autocentric, as anybody who's driven or parked there actually knows. And it raises some of the issues about the trade-offs between mitigation and adaptation that need to be addressed. Increasing urban density can reduce travel demand and hence emissions, and urban electrification powered by hydropower, biofuel or other sources can impact aquatic, coastal and marine ecosystems. Next slide, please. So cities can implement aggressive, ambitious mitigation policies and achieve the other sustainable development goals at the same time. So, big message, pursuing mitigation and adaptation actions together can improve and enhance human and planetary health and makes the final point, our climate is our future. And I probably slightly overrun, my apologies for that.
No, Jim, thank you very much. Well, there you have it, folks. 7 years of work and about 11,000 pages distilled into 30 minutes of overview and what it means for cities. Kidding aside, we are so lucky to have this level of representation and support from the IPCC. But that does kind of conclude the overview of the process and a deep dive into the science. And now what I'd like to bring us to is discussion with some of the other communities of practice